To solve quadratic equations by the quadratic formula, you have to know the quadratic formula, of course, and this is what it is down here. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So you have learned that in previous courses. This is just a review of it. And this only works if you have something in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. We call that the standard form, and it has to equal 0. That allows us to determine the constants a, b, and c that we will plug into your quadratic formula and then go about simplifying. So as we look at an example together, we know that we have x squared minus 2x squared minus 3x minus 15, but it's equal to 5. So our very first step is to want to be able to get that equal to 0, because that's a must. So you're going to do that by subtracting 5 on both sides. Always when you're trying to solve a quadratic with an x squared, you want it to equal 0. So you have 2x squared minus 3x minus 20 now, and that is equal to 0. And that's important for us to be able to figure out what our a, b, and c are. And so that's what we're going to talk about right now. So our a is going to equal 2, our b is going to equal a negative 3, and a c, or our c, is going to equal a negative 20. So those are the values we're going to use to plug into this and then simplify to be able to come up with our two answers. So the first major hurdle is to get each of these a, b's, and c's into our quadratic formula, and that's going to be when we have x equals, and now we have the opposite of b, so b is a negative 3, so we put that in there, plus or minus the square root of the total of b squared, so I'm going to put b in parentheses, that's squared, minus 4 times a times c in order to come up with our quadratic formula in the numerator, and now that is all over 2a, and that 2a comes from down here, and so the 2 is here, and that 2 comes from your a value. So all of this stuff inside here, this is the b squared minus 4ac, that's all of this stuff underneath the square root. And it's really important that you simplify that correctly. So being careful with your positives and negatives and your multiplication is our next step for simplification. So what we start with is this x equals. Opposite of a negative 3 is equal to a positive 3. Then you have a plus or minus. The square root of negative 3 squared is a positive 9. And then you have a minus 4 times 2, which is 8. And then 8 times negative 20 is a negative 160. So I kept that negative here, and that 4 times everything is a negative 160. Those negatives turn into addition. Negative turns into adding. And then that will all be over 4 because of 2 times 2. So be careful with how you handle this negative here with that negative. I chose to keep the negative here and then multiply a positive 4 times 2 times negative 20 to get a negative 160. You have a choice. You could say a negative 4 times 2 times negative 20 would be a positive 160 in the end. So that's your choice. So we have one more step of simplification. That's going to be x equals 3 plus or minus still. 9 plus 160 is 169, and that's all over 4. Now 169 is a nice square number, so we can actually do this square root of 169 at this point, and we get 3 plus or minus 13, and that's all over 4. This is the time that we take care of this plus or minus, because what that tells us is that there are actually two solutions out of this whole expression. One where it's 3 plus 13 all over 4, and one where it's 3 minus 13 all over 4. And so that's how we end up with our two solutions out of our quadratic formula. And so in this particular scenario, that's 16 over 4, and then you're going to get a negative 10 over 4, which means our final two answers for this quadratic equation are x equals 4 and x equals negative 5 halves, or you could also write negative 2.5 that comes out of the 10 over 4 as you reduce it. And those are our final answers for this quadratic equation. So following these steps is really important. You have to have this quadratic formula memorized, and you have to find the correct a, b, and c, meaning this has to be equal to 0. Be really careful with your simplification and your combining like terms and order of operations.